Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Very glad that you all are here. I know it's spring break for many schools, and so, hopefully traffic wasn't too bad. And it's pretty outside, so glad that you are with us today. We are going to continue in Romans, chapters 12 and 13. We only have one more week after this week of the letter to the Romans, and so I hope that you are keeping up with us as we go. A reminder that next week we will be off. It is my spring break, and so we will be skipping that week and back in 2 weeks where we will finish up the book of the Romans. And so a reminder that I hope you will grab a schedule. If you do not get Buv's emails, then please visit stmichael.org/RBS, sign up for her emails, and you can make sure that you know week to week what our schedule is going to be. And so let's jump in with a prayer, and we'll get started. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, in this season of Lent, we ask that you open us up. Help us to put down those things which worry us, scare us, weigh us down, so that you can fill us with your Spirit. Over this next hour, help us to receive the gift of your Spirit so that we can be transformed, and that as we make choices over these next 40 days, we can make choices that will draw us closer and closer to you. Be with those that we hold in our hearts and minds, those who need your presence, and may they feel our prayers. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, gang, so we are getting to the end of Romans, and so reminder, please ask questions as we go because that's very helpful to everybody. I did get one question this past week that I thought was quite good to start with, and the person who wrote in said that they've gone back through their notes of Bible study on Paul, and they know that he was born in Turkey, that he was trained as a lawyer, that he was a tent maker, he spoke and wrote multiple languages, all that good stuff. Then asked if I thought that God chose him randomly to become the man that he became to help spread the church, or if God actually chose him because he was already gifted in all of these ways. And it's such a great question because it really asks us to wrestle with giftedness. And so part of what I want us to consider is that everyone has gifts. Yes. We know, and it's St. Paul really who leans into the idea of spiritual gifts more than anyone else, that our giftedness is unique and that God calls us to use our gifts in the world. And in the use of our gifts, we're really helping to build up God's kingdom as we go. Great. I think that we can all agree on that. The question, though, is not necessarily about whether we have gifts or not, but whether God has given us certain gifts, or if because we have developed certain gifts, God then calls us or chooses us to do certain work. And so what I would want us to wrestle with is that time and time again in the Bible, God calls people who are not able to do things that they don't think they can do. Again and again, God calls people who do not believe in themselves, who might have actual, tangible evidence of not being able to do whatever God is asking them to do. And then they push back on God when God calls them to do a thing. And then God always says, just try, or I will be with you. And so a way to put this that I like, that is relatively elegant, I didn't make it up, is God does not call the equipped. God equips the called. And that's just nice and easy. And so, yes, of course, Paul had great gifts. And we can say, in hindsight, Paul was able to do the work that he did much because he had these gifts that were already developed in him. So, of course, once God called him, he used the gifts he had. But I think it is too much for us to say that it was only the gifts God possessed before he was called. Only the gifts that Paul possessed before he was called that allowed him to do what he did. It was really a combination, a meeting of both his giftedness and his willingness to use those gifts and God's equipping him because he was called, just like the rest of us. All of us are called. When we confidently give of the gifts we have, God, in a sense, meets us and develops us and expands those gifts so that then we can do what God is calling us to do. And I think I've said to you all before my own call story to the priesthood, which included me saying no, and then the bishop at the time reading the story of Jonah to me and essentially saying, you can say no to God's call, but the call will follow you and chase you. And ultimately, you will say yes. So save yourself the trouble and just say yes now. And I kind of love that because I think that's for all of us. All of us, every one of us, has gifts and are called. We can absolutely say no. And we can say no for a long time. But the call will follow us and keep chasing us. And so regardless of where we are in our life, just say yes, because it will save you time. And you'll be more productive because you say yes earlier. And so I think that that is the way that I understand Paul's call from God. Of course he had gifts, but so do we. And of course he used his gifts to do what God called him to do. And so can we. And so guard yourself against thinking that you are unable to do the thing that God is calling you to do. Because if God calls you, then God knows you have the gifts you need. And that when you give those gifts over, with God's help, you'll be able to do the thing you're called to do. Questions or comments on that? Yes, ma'am.
Would you repeat that wonderful thing you said?
Oh, sure. God does not call the equipped. God equips the called. I know, it's so good, right? It is so good. I told you I didn't make it up. But when I heard it, I thought, thank you. That in so succinctly is what I need to hear. Any other questions? All right. We are now moving into chapter 12. We'll do 12 and 13 today, and we're going to separate today's lesson in 3 parts. We're going to speak of the new life we have in Jesus, what is the mark of a Christian, and the purpose of love. Those are our 3 sections today that will take us through chapters 12 and 13. The big idea in chapter 12 and 13 that I want us to hold is that this is the final, the 4th section of the book of the letter to the Romans. So as noted at the very beginning, the letter is divided into 4 distinct sections, and chapter 12 begins the final, the 4th section. So the beginning, essentially the big arc of the letter to the Romans is meant to communicate that the gospel, 1, reveals God's righteousness, 2, creates a new humanity, 3, fulfills God's promise to Israel, and then 4, unifies the church. And it's that 4th section that we begin with chapter 12. Paul is leaning into the unification that happens in the church. And so what I want to make very clear is that essentially up to now, Paul has focused, not solely but mostly, on what it means to be an individual follower or disciple of Jesus. Now in this last section, Paul is really pushing that idea into community. It's sort of like what I have said in here before, which is, when someone asks, can you be Christian on your own? The answer really is kinda, but it's not a good idea. Being Christian necessarily calls us into community. But because of our humanity, because of our ego, and because of our confidence that we know a lot and can be very certain about what we know, community is not a given. Community is not automatic. Our humanity often puts us at odds with other people, and those conflicts and disagreements can keep us from actually being unified in Christ the way that God intends us to be. And so this last section of the letter is focusing on the unity that God hopes we will have through Christ in the church. Okay, So with that said, let's jump into the first section of chapter 12. So Paul is now setting the table to address really what the church is meant to be. Paul understands that theologically speaking, individual access to faith is important. Of course it is. However, Paul understands that the challenge of living on our own is essentially insurmountable on our own. That we need one another. We need to be in community. We need the accountability that community provides us so that individually we can do what we were just talking about, use our gifts to the benefit of the world because of what God calls us into. But it's the community that helps us not only identify our gifts, but to use them faithfully. So, Paul believes very firmly that unity is the intention of discipleship. That's a big challenge because I think Paul really understands at this point in his life that, as I might paraphrase, when 2 or 3 are gathered, there are disagreements. And so, Jesus might say he's present, but my God, it's just, when you get a bunch of people together, you have more opinions. It made me think of that old joke, like, how many Episcopalians does it take to change a light bulb? Call the electrician, 1 to drinks, and 1 to talk about how great the old light bulb was. So, and you can do that with every group. So just, if you, it's pretty hysterical. I remember there was one take to change a light bulb, 0 because lumens don't change. What was it? How many Pentecostals does it take to change a light bulb? 1, because their hands are already in the air. It's just like on and on and on. So, as Episcopalians, we understand that when you have a number of people together, you have at least that many opinions. And so Paul really pragmatically is trying to address what it means to be a community as disciples of Jesus, because he knows it is not automatic. And in particular, in the Roman church, like many of the churches that he planted himself, you have this mix of people who, before their faith in Jesus, would have never associated with each other. They would have never actually spent any meaningful time together, forget trying to relate to one another in a community. And so Paul is very aware of the challenge, of the hurdles of community, because in Christ, a community of Christians is almost always going to be highly diverse. So, Paul wants us to put aside being headstrong and confident about every single thing that we think in order to preference and prioritize the unity of the church. And so in that church in Rome, Paul is trying to encourage them to not only embrace their diversity for the good use of their gifts, but to make sure that that never undermines the unity that they find together. So let's just look at chapter 12. We'll start at verse 1. Paul writes, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness, and on and on. So what Paul is saying here is, of course you're different, and of course you have gifts, and of course you have skills. No one person's gift or skills, and no one person's confidence in being right should ever be above holding the unity of the whole. And so this is critically important to Paul, because in his experience thus far, we know where Romans fits in his experience. He's planted a bunch of church communities. He's already written letters to deal with certain questions that those church communities have had. And so in that context, Paul is aware that it is incredibly easy for a group of people to fall off the path, to kind of go off the rails about dumb little specific stuff. And they can get so embedded, enmeshed in that conflict that they can miss the bigger point. And so Paul is closing the entire letter. Remember, his most theologically significant piece of writing that we have, by focusing on unity. His appeal right now anchors itself in one critical theological idea. And so this week and next week, I want us to really hold this idea right in front of us. Paul speaks of the present age, and Paul speaks of the age to come. This is a philosophical approach to understanding what is happening in the world right now. For Paul, we are in between what had been before Jesus and what will be when Christ returns to recreate the whole world. We're in that in-between time. And so we have to live between what is the present age, that is what we see around us. This is not complicated. It's the world. So it's the food we eat, it's the cars we drive in, it's the homes we live in, it's the money in our bank account, it's all those things. That's the world. That's the present age. And Paul wants to make sure that we are always looking toward the age to come. And by the age to come, Paul is essentially saying what Jesus is actively making now. We are part of that building up. We are part of that making new. It just hasn't fully happened yet. And so we are in that in-between place. And this present age idea sets up what Paul does in the next few chapters, which is differentiating who we are to be as disciples of Jesus, held in tension with the fact that we're still in the world. So Paul is not being too fluffy here. He is actually being quite pragmatic when he not only acknowledges, but then tries to help us figure out how to both live in this world and to also live with the hopefulness, very tangibly, of what Jesus is doing in the future. So let's speak about what that is to be. Make no mistake, what Paul is really talking about here is being countercultural. And we can throw around that term countercultural a lot. And of course, in the intervening 2,000 years, that's become a relatively easy way to define what it means to be a Christian disciple. But what Paul is getting at here with that countercultural argument is more a literal, not the culture. So if we think about what countercultural really means, we're not really talking about being hippie. We're talking about not succumbing to the way that the world structures itself. When we think of what is the worldly culture, we can think about the way in which the world, the culture, defines value. And we know this. Just take a moment and think about what is most valuable to you. Now, you can go off and say love, that's fine, that's good. But if we're actually think about the way we act, think about the way we worry, think about the way we make choices, I think although we might, at our best, say what is most important, health, love, sure. But when we actually think about the way we act, what keeps us up at night, it's probably not health and love. It's probably much more tangible, non-sexy, super cultural things. And so I would want us to be honest, be vulnerable enough to be honest that there are worldly things that worry us. Because when we are honest about that, then we can receive Paul's invitation around being countercultural and begin to work on actually letting some of those things go. We are still human. We are still in between. We will never do that perfectly. But can we do it a little better? Of course we can. Can we actually focus a little more or more often on what God is calling us to be and to do? Of course we can. And over time, we can actually make a big shift. I know I've used this example before in sermons, but I remember when I went to one summer camp, we were dropped off at the edge of the woods, and we were given a compass and a bunch of instructions. And we were separated into teams of, I don't remember, 4 to 6, something like that. And we were told we had to make our way through the woods to a lake, and that's where we would be camping that night. And in order to make our way through, we had to find marked trees along the way. So essentially it would say things like, go 40 yards this direction or this specific, when you look at a compass, it's the numbers, like degrees, thank you. This specific degree in order to find that tree with a little X. Great. So we started off and it was relatively easy because it was, 20, 30, 40 yards, which you can essentially see, like, there's the tree. Okay, that's pretty easy. Then it got much farther where you could certainly not see the tree. And you had to maintain a particular course heading over a decent amount of distance. And we certainly had the experience where we would go about as far as we thought we should, no tree. So then what do? Go back to the other tree, really get precise, like really hold the compass steady, take the steps very specifically to then find the next tree that was very far away. And so we had that experience, I don't know, I was 7th grade maybe. And so it was this wonderful example to me of the way I think life works, which is, if we talk about being a child, what is the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do? Pretty simple. Do the right thing. If you do the wrong thing, apologize. Life is not terribly complicated when you're 3 or 5. Then when you get to be 35 or 65, the complications kind of stack on top of each other. And it's almost like the trees are really far apart. And God's trying to get you to go in a certain direction, but if you're just a few degrees off, over the course of a quarter mile, you will never find that tree. In a sense, Paul is trying to urge us to consider those small ways that we can actually make a big difference over time. We often think to ourselves, right and wrong, black and white. If we are wrong, because we are broken and we are human and we are fallible, then we have to change 180 degrees in order to be right. And that's just a lot of drama, and that's not really theologically sound. Instead, most of us, if we just move a few degrees, which in the short term, that's very easy. In the long term, the impact is significant. And if we every day think to ourselves, move 1 or 2 degrees, just a little, of 360 degrees, 1 degree, not that big a deal. But if you do that for 40 days, like Lent, or a year, or 40 years, man, you find yourself in a totally different place. You've become a totally different person. And that's the kind of countercultural argument that Paul is really making here in chapter 12. And for Paul, he believes very strongly that this change is anchored in the transforming of the mind. Now, we can say that Paul, as a person, certainly prophet, saint, good guy, is one guy. And so his opinion, although important, is not always to be the complete opinion. We named in the question at the beginning of class, Paul is an intellectual. Paul has been a great student. Paul has high intellectual skill. And so it is not surprising to me that Paul would anchor his theology on the transforming of the mind. Because for Paul, the mind is his great gift. And so he understands that what God has done for him is very much an intellectual transformation. Now, for some of us, we might actually experience the world very heady, very intellectual. And so the transforming of the mind really does matter. For others of us, we may not experience the world first intellectually, and instead we may experience the world emotionally. And so then what I wish for you to hear is that the discipleship transformation that God's inviting you into is actually anchored and begins with the transforming of your heart. It matters what you need and who you are and how you experience the world around you. Are you a bit more a thinking person, a feeling person? Are you a gut person? Like, where are you in how you move first through the world? And then hear Paul's invitation to actually focus on that first. Transform what is your prime motivator first, because then the rest of it will kind of fall in line. Paul, however, as good students, we should know, emphasizes the transforming of the mind. And this is totally consistent with what Paul has written in the past. If we go back to chapter 1 of Romans, Paul speaks of the human rebellion against God, and it was about wrong thinking. It is what Paul has proposed to us from the very beginning. And so now that he's getting all the way to the idea of unity in the church, it makes total sense, it is very rational, that Paul would return to the idea of being transformed in our minds in order to then allow unity to be the first priority. With that, I think we're done with the first section of the first part of chapter 12. Thoughts or questions on that? Yes.
I just want to be on the right track. When I'm thinking in the middle of the night is about my kids or my health, so if I want to just sort of, will you lead me a little bit to what you're thinking?
Sure. So you're saying if what keeps you up at night is your kids or your health, then what I would challenge you to unpack is what is actually worrying you. Because when we say, let's just take children. When we say our children, what's the actual fear? My guess is the fear is not that they're having the best day of their life. That's probably not keeping you up at night, because that's good for them. It's probably, where are they? Are they safe? Are they dead? We joke of proof of life, sort of stuff. I can tell you right now, my oldest is on spring break. And when we talked to him Friday morning, he said he's going out somewhere in West Texas, kind of west of Hill Country, with a group of friends. And he said, I don't know if we're gonna have a cell signal for the next 5 days. Okay. So, thankfully, Nicole and I are not worriers. We just kind of went, okay, good luck. And he's supposed to be back Wednesday night. Let us know you get back. So we don't need the proof of life stuff if we know that we're not gonna get it. Now, it'd be different if he's supposed to just be on campus and we can't get in touch with him. Okay, that's a little different. But if we know for the next 5 days he's no cell signal, okay, we'll talk to you in 5 days. That's no problem. So I think when we say we worry about our kids, my guess is there's a fear there that something is wrong. Right. So what I would want us to differentiate is we're not worried about our kids in the sort of cosmic way of like our children are the future, or whatever. It's much more about, are they okay? So what is then the fear? And what I would propose is that the fear is some form of, honestly, it's some form of death. It could be sickness, it could be illness, it could be injury, it could be crisis, it could be death. There is what is worrying us is the idea that we could lose them. Yes. So that lose them idea is, I would say, Paul would argue, is a hurdle to actually anchoring ourselves in the age to come. Because if we think theologically, now this is where the feeling matters. So I don't want to say the feeling does not matter. But if we think just theologically, what is actually happening through Christ? The world as we know it, our whole lives are being transformed. What Jesus actually does on the cross, when Jesus is buried, is he transforms death. So, for example, I just wrote a podcast script for Good Friday, so spoiler alert. What I talk about, I always say on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, Happy Ash Wednesday, that's what I said last week. Happy Good Friday is what I say on Good Friday, and I typically get two reactions. If someone knows me, they kind of roll their eyes and they're like, sure, Chris, Happy Good Friday. If someone doesn't know me, they're confused because that seems, what? Happy? Well, it's in the name. It's Good Friday. So being happy, that's okay, but what are we actually happy about? So that's the thing to unpack. Because Jesus died. Why are you happy? Well, because in Jesus' death, he defeats death. When Jesus is buried, he actually overcomes everything that should scare us about this world. And then in his resurrection, what he does is gives us the glimpse of the hope of the age to come. At our best, now I say at our best because not a one of us will actually get there, but at our best, we can differentiate the worry of loss from the reality of the hope that whatever happens in this world will be made right. Every tear will be wiped away, everything will be made new. That includes even death. Now, I would say I would much rather be the one to die than my child. However, death itself is only temporary. And every person who's listening understands that death is only temporary, especially if they are still here and they've experienced profound loss. Because the loss of, what's the worst thing? Loss of a child. It's the worst. And still, what we're actually given as the gift of Christ is that the pain we feel is only temporary. It doesn't mean we don't feel it. And it doesn't mean that we wouldn't feel it every day for the rest of our life. But when Paul speaks of the transforming of our mind, what Paul's actually challenging us to accept is that even that profound pain is temporary. Because the promise is that not only will anyone we've lost be okay right now, yes, but we will be too at some point in the future. That's the hope. And that's the tension that we hold whenever we bury someone who should not have died. And that's perhaps the difference. Ann Johnson used to sit right here in this front pew and did for years and years and years. She died a few weeks ago at 95. Okay, when you bury someone at 95, that's a real celebration. Wonderful woman. Great family, such a big celebration. Nobody in that room thought that losing Anne at 95 was unfair or not right. Yes, of course, miss her, sure. But God, thank God for what a wonderful life. Then, when we bury babies or children or young adults, one of the first things I always say is, this is not okay. This is not okay. We have to admit it's not okay. To then hold right there in tension that God understands that it's not okay. And the hope we have that it will be okay in the future is still present. And that's essentially what we have to wrestle with every day. And for those of us who may not have experienced that kind of loss yet, we can still sit in the idea. That's the transforming of the mind. For those of you who have experienced that loss, by still being here, you have the faithfulness of the promise that I believe is very real. And I think that trying to pull those two apart is actually the countercultural piece Paul is inviting us into. So that when you worry, Paul's not saying don't worry. We can't help it. We cannot help how we feel. What Paul is saying is when you worry, get yourself to a place where you can actually stop and say, like, take a breath. What am I actually worried about? Then be honest. What are you worried about? And then try. And at the beginning, it's only a try. But maybe over time, you can actually hand that over to God and say, I'm not in control of this. I cannot change this. And when you give that control over to God, you actually find a bit of peace. You cannot help how you feel, but you can over time condition yourself and train yourself and, theologically speaking, transform yourself into the kind of person who can feel it, kind of take the hit, and then let it go. And make that automatic. Make it a habit. Because then you will live primarily in that sense of peace in the future. It's never going to be 100%. But it can be better tomorrow than today. It can be better a year from now than today. And it can certainly be better 10, 20 years from now than today. And the better is part of God's promise. Yeah? Other comments or questions?
Do you think that that transition is more difficult for some people and less difficult for other people?
When you ask
All the same.
when you ask about transition, you mean getting kind of from a moment of grief into sort of a future, what would I say, balance, maybe? Of course, it's different for different people. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way you were brought up. I'll use myself as an example. I've always been quite comfortable talking about death, and I attribute that primarily to having grown up in a family where my mother's older sister died in a car accident when she was a teenager. And so my younger sister's named for my mother's older sister who died. And I think that being in the story of our family has always kept death, it's always made death very real, very possible. Because I've never really lived in this sense of people won't die, because people did die. And I think that as a child, when that's what you're taught, then the fear of death is far lower. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but I think that there is the expectation that people will die, which makes, of course people will die. I say that, and I also acknowledge none of us get out of here alive. So it should not surprise anyone. However, I cannot tell you how many times it does surprise people. I bet a third of the time I talk to families when we are planning funeral services for one of their family members, what is actually being discussed in that moment is the surprise that they died. Now, again, there are natural deaths, like one expects to bury their grandparents. That is a natural thing. One probably shouldn't expect to bury a child. Okay, so we can hold those two things very separately. And death is possible all the time for any of us. And if we resist that reality, by the way, that's not morbid, that's just true. And if we resist that truth, we actually do set ourselves up to be on a cliff of grief that we might not recover from. And so one of the things that I say to parents of young children all the time is never hide death from them. There are lots of parents who, and if you have done this, then sorry, you're fine, it's okay. But people who are raising kids now, if a pet dies, if a friend dies, if there is death in the news, don't hide that from them because they're not naturally afraid like adults. Just because an adult is afraid of death does not mean a child is. And almost entirely, children do not fear except what they're taught to fear. And so if you as an adult teach them to fear death, of course they will fear it. But if as an adult you teach them that death is natural, and by the way, that's our whole story. I mean, we should as Christians never hide death because Jesus died. And so it's in our story, it is baked in, it's right there. And so death should not be hidden. And as long as death is not hidden, then I think death can be less scary. Death can still hurt, and we can be sad, and we will grieve, of course. But to your specific question, can some people move out of that grief better than others? Of course, yes, but I think the people who move out of that grief better than others are those who have actually spent time. Maybe they've been given the gift as a child. That's wonderful. But if they weren't, they've spent time as an adult genuinely wrestling with the reality of death and that it hurts and that the promise as disciples of Jesus is that death is not the last word and death is not the end. It is simply a step in the entire arc of life. That's the promise that we're made. The promise of Jesus isn't that we're going to be polite. The promise of Jesus is not that we're going to be well-mannered or have pretty things. That's not it. And we can sure forget that that's not the promise. The promise that we get from God is that death is not the end. That's the real promise. And if we spend enough time really wrestling with that and anchoring ourselves in that, then I do think we prepare ourselves better to then accept and deal with and move on from the grief of the loss that we experience when we experience it, because we all will. Some of us more than others, but none of us go through life without experiencing that grief. Other thoughts or questions? This is good stuff. All right then. Well, after that light section, let's move on to the second half of chapter 12. Paul focuses in the second part of chapter 12 on what it means to be a true Christian, the mark of a true Christian. And so rather than keeping his ideas of discipleship at a real high level, he comes down a little bit. I think Paul thinks he comes down a lot. He doesn't really. But he does come from like complete stratospheric macro to at least a little bit more tangible. Let's look at verse 9. Paul says, "Let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers." So in these few verses, Paul just lays it out, hit by hit by hit by hit. That's what a Christian life looks like. That's what being a disciple of Jesus looks like. And not a one of those things is easy to do, let alone all of them. And so that's what takes the practice. I was recently in an interview where someone asked me whether I thought it was important to be religious or just spiritual. And my answer is always that religion is the structure that allows you to be truly spiritual. So put another way, in our human messiness and with our human egotism, we naturally are not going to do spirituality very well because we are self-centered. Instead, we've got boundaries around us that I would argue is religion that just kind of helps move us in the right direction. If we can submit and if we can, in humility, kind of stay within the boundaries of religious structures, then over time, our spirituality will develop and deepen in a real meaningful way. That's the accountability. That's what Paul's really saying when he says community matters. We need each other to keep ourselves in the lane, so to speak. Now, I do believe with different kinds of religious boundaries, it's very legitimate that we would go off seeking the kinds of religious boundaries that make most sense to us, that we think will help us the most, and that we do not argue about being the most right religion. I think we have to be a bit more generous and humble than that. But I do think that the people who say they are spiritual and not religious is just lazy and actually don't want to be accountable to the spirituality that they give lip service to following. Some people, I think, are probably good enough to do it, but most are not. And so Paul really here he lists off all these things, and I think to myself, well, I don't know. I might do one of those. And so what we do then, as a part of the community, is try to create a system that will help us do all of these things better than we would on our own. If we keep going in chapter 12, look at verse 14. He actually gets a little tougher here, starting with verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, there are a few parts there that Paul quotes, and it's a little intense. But I think what Paul is really trying to get at is don't seek on your own and of your own volition the kind of justice that you think God wants. Let God seek the justice. You just love. Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor. Jesus did not say, go out and make sure justice is yours. There is a difference there, and we can, very innocently, begin to be God's defenders. Like when injustice happens, we go out and we seek our justice. And what Paul's writing here is a disciple should not go seeking the justice and the vengeance, but allow God to seek the justice and the vengeance. Now, that's what Paul said. This is problematic when it comes to the way the world works. I would argue, from a discipleship standpoint, this is a very nice starting place. We should start from a place of love, unity, peacefulness, all of that. We should start from a place that does not seek to justify the world in our image or get vengeance for wrong done because we think it's important. Then, if there is a genuine wrestling and a genuine discernment, I would argue that it is important for us to say that sometimes you love a person by defending them, and that you don't simply love someone with inaction. That's tough. And don't even ask a question because I'm not doing that today. But there is a discipline in theology called theodicy, which is essentially, oftentimes people call it just war theory. There is this attempt theologically to say, at what point is defending someone the best way to love them? Because when we say defending, we necessarily mean take action for justice that is, in a sense, owning the way that the world has wronged someone or something or a group of people, and on and on. Just war is very complicated, and it's super complex. I can tell you that I am very comfortable saying it is not good enough to love people by inaction. That love is a verb, and that love is active, and that there are likely, I'm not going to say likely, there are times when love as an action means defending those who are being hurt. How, when, and to what level, that's above my pay grade. And so we're not going to do it right. And sometimes we just do things and it's not right, and we do it anyway. And I think that's kind of what's being human. It makes me think of, 2-3 years ago, I discussed Dietrich Bonhoeffer in here. And he's a great example of this exact idea. Bonhoeffer, as a German theologian in the rise of the Third Reich, tried his best to write about love and write about peace and write about the proper treatment of people and on and on and on. And after years of this, he and a few of his theological colleagues decided that it was actually the most just way to act is to assassinate Hitler. And it was not an easy decision. It was one that he very much struggled with. And he was ultimately executed for being caught trying to assassinate Hitler. But he has a bunch of writings that took him from the point at which he sort of is right here with Paul saying, this is not mine, to saying, there is such presence of evil that doing something that is hurtful to one to save the many is not only just, but it is also loving as a Christian disciple. Man, that's tough. And he, far smarter than me, struggled for years with this idea. And so because of his example, and there are others over time, I have to acknowledge that, yes, there could be that time. But most of the time, it is not ours to struggle with. Most of us are not going to be in a position where we have to make that kind of massive decision around justice. I'm talking about, did someone put pickles on your sandwich when you asked for them not to? Calm down, I mean, it is amazing how we can freak out over the smallest stuff and feel like we have been wronged. I mean, there are people in my life, and I will not tell you who they are, but I can give you a list real fast, that I do not really like talking to, because there is nothing that they like talking about more than all the ways they have been wronged. And man, their lists are thorough. I mean, every little thing they can tell you, and they can list it again and again and again, and it's like they just spin in this experience of injustice. And it's never more than like pickles on your sandwich. I mean, and I'm sorry, that's not loving. But it's so sad. And every time I want to say to them, God, think of all the things that are going well. Like, what's going well today? I mean, I hate to be that guy, but I try. And then they don't, it's offensive, whatever. So I think that there is a way that we don't have to be extreme in how we understand what Paul is saying. There is the very, very small, and then there is the very, very big. And most of us live far closer to the small most of the time than we live to the big. And so it is much more of a challenge. It's like a little holy nudge to just chill out a little bit. And when we find ourselves losing our mind over pickles, to just stop and say, you know, this could be better. I could respond better. And in the same way we worry about children at night, in those small moments, take a deep breath. You know, the whole count to 10 business, actually, it's kind of helpful. And then don't just try to be more polite or well-mannered. Actually try to anchor yourself intellectually and emotionally in what Jesus is calling us to be. Because it is that kind of theological anchor that can then move us degree by degree, year by year, in a really meaningful way. That's the gift of Lent, in my opinion. Every year, the church says, all right, people, what do you need to work on? And only you know, and only you can be honest about what you need to work on. And regardless of where we are in our life, we can always do more work. What do you need to work on? And you get 40 days, where if you're coming to church every Sunday, you get someone like me reminding you, did you do the thing that you said you would work on? And if you said yes, oh my gosh, it feels so good. Good for you. And if you didn't, it's not about feeling bad or being shamed. It's about, here's another chance. Do it this week. And that is so good for us because we're just human. It will never be perfect, but always can be better. All right, questions about that? That's really the end of a second.
Two quick comments. That when you talk about people that do that, a friend of mine calls that speaking victimese. So you might think of that.
Speaking victimese?
Yes. You might
That's
think of
great.
that next time they do that. And then the second thing is, for me, as far as what is my part? I always have a part somewhere. And the part generally is that I'm letting you rent space in my head.
Yeah, what is my part in this? Yep.
And everybody has a part.
It is interesting to talk about what is your part in this. I love that phrase, letting you rent space in my head. I do think that there are some people who are gluttons for punishment, and they go back again and again. You know, what's almost even, oh gosh, am I going to say this? Yes, okay. What's almost even worse than the person who is speaking the victimese is the person who continues to go back and listen to them speak victimese. I am grateful for never needing people to like me so that I don't do that because I'm a pretty happy person. I mean, all things being equal. And oftentimes I think I'm happy because I don't really spend the time with the people who bring me down. What is it that psychologists say? We are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Think about that. And if you think, we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with, and when I've thought through that, like my own children, my family members, I think that's pretty right. I think it's powerfully right. And if you are not spending most of your time with people who are building you up the way you hope to be built up, you are probably not being built up. And if you're spending time with people who are bringing you down in ways you would like to not be brought down, you're probably actually being brought down. And so for us, some of the honest work that we can do as disciples is prioritizing the people who will help to reinforce who we hope to be, who we actually intellectually would like to commit to be. And that gets us right back to what Paul is saying about community. The unity in the church, in the community we find in church, is just a larger way of saying we're the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Because if we spend the most time with the people who are trying to help build us up in our discipleship, moving us closer to God day by day, we're probably getting built up and moving closer to God. And if we're not, we're probably not. And time's up. It's great to see you all. We will not be next week, so I will see you back here in 2 weeks where we will finish up Romans. Bye, everybody.